Hello, everyone, and welcome to our rescheduled stream. We had one planned before, we had to reschedule. I'm really excited tonight to have this lovely guest on. My name is Jasmine. I'm a witchy content creator. You know, check out the channel, whatever. Cool. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kelden. I am the author of The Crooked Path, an introduction to traditional witchcraft, and The Witches Sabbath, an exploration of history, folklore, and modern practice.
Happy to have you back again.
It's good to be back.
I had Kelden on. You came on for The Crooked Path, and we talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel like reading that book before this book, I really found it to be like very beneficial. Because I read The Crooked Path first, and I feel like that was like such a really good introduction to like this whole conversation. So I would also, even though in this stream we're going to be more focusing on the Witches Sabbath, I like highly recommend The Crooked Path to anyone who's interested in just witchcraft, period, even if you aren't necessarily interested in traditional witchcraft or whatever you choose to identify as. I think it's a good read anyway. And I think that Kelden did a really good job breaking a lot of that sometimes very dry material down in a really fun way. Like, I think you did a really good job with that. So let's get into The Crooked Path, or not The Crooked Path. Let's get into the Witches Sabbath.
Yes.
So how do we want to start off with this? Why don't you, I know you already in the book kind of put it in your own words, but on this live, for people who are like, the Witches Sabbath, like, what is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the biggest thing to like put out there right away is like the difference between the Witches Sabbath and what we're very familiar with as modern practitioners, whether witches or Wiccans or pagans. We're typically most familiar with the concept of the Sabbaths or the Wheel of Year as being this set of seasonal holidays. For some people, it's really about marking the seasonal tides. For some people, it's really about being this narrative of the great mother goddess and the horned god. But when I'm talking about the Witches Sabbath, I'm talking about this historic and folkloric concept of witches gathering in the night, whether that is in person or really as this otherworldly event. Witches are gathering in spirit form, and this is typically presided over by the devil. And they come together and they do magic and they sort of revel in debauchery and things like that. And so really that's what I'm talking about. And I'm sure we'll probably get into some of this, but really that's actually where the concept of the Sabbaths and the Wheel of Year, I mean, that is its ancestor. That's one of the ways that the Witches Sabbath has come to be within the modern era, but it's not the only way. And that's, I think, the big part of what we'll talk about tonight is the way in which a lot of witches still engage with the concept of the Sabbath as this otherworldly spiritual gathering.
Well, and I really like in the book too, you kind of also talk about like this metaphysical spiritual concept of like traveling to this astral Sabbath. But then also you do talk about like doing something similar in the physical as well. And like, I thought that was especially cool that you included that. A lot of the material that I had like really looked at prior to was more like focused on like, this is someplace you go astrally, as opposed to like something that you could do here in the physical. And so I really enjoyed that part of the book. Also, chapter 1, I have to really give you like some kudos for that, because that was so much history and there was so much there. There's so many names, so many dates all packed in. I have my book club notes here. This is my book club notebook. And I just finished the Witches Sabbath the other day. I had been listening to it on an audio and then also reading it. So kind of going back and forth. And like when I was driving or if I was at work or if I was like doing laundry or cleaning, I was listening to the audio version. And then like if I wanted to actually like relax and like really if I had time to focus, I'd sit down, make some tea and like physically read through the book. Which also too, you guys, this book aesthetically is also a vibe. This is the book that we're talking about. 10s. It's a 10 for me. But like, look at this, Kelden. Like, okay, I have, this is March 25th is when I took these notes. And there's this page, and this page that I took.
Yay! That's like, what I like. I like that.
Like I jotted a bunch of stuff down, like the word Sabbath and like appearing in 1446. Like I wrote that down. I found that to be really interesting. Like there's a lot of history in chapter 1. And I'll be honest, I did find chapter 1 a little bit dry, but that's me. That's just because like I'm like flamboyant and over the top. But I really appreciate all of the history that was packed into it, and it's well worth. I feel like, especially maybe for people who might be like me and have some reading comprehension things sometimes where like we have to reread something 4 or 5 times for our brain to actually interpret what the hell we just read. I think it's really worth taking your time. Also, like the Roman pagans accusing Christians of cannibalism and infanticide, all of that. Like I didn't know any of that at all. So I took a lot from that. What else do I have on here? The Bill and Vox Rome, the Pope Gregory.
Vox and Rama.
Yes. And like condemning heresy, promoting crusades. Antonio Galsena imprisoned. Drank excrement from a toad.
Yeah, real good stuff.
Worshipping of like a dragon.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, chapter 1 is by far like the densest chapter in the book. And I would say to anybody, who like maybe has a harder time with, different comprehensions or, just maybe finding it a little bit dry, is to take your time and break it down.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I wrote notes when I was going through chapter 1 too. Like I thought it was really important because the information in there I think is really important. And it's information that like I wanted to be sure I was understanding. And so I think the fact that it is accessible in an audio format, a physical copy, both of those I think is really good for people also who might have reading comprehension issues.
Right. I highly recommend the audiobook. I was really happy with how it turned out. I think the narrator Tegan did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
Especially of making I like the personality that she brought to it. And like she kind of enlivened a lot of the words in her own way that I really appreciated. So I think, if you are into audiobooks or if you just want maybe like a different take on it, like it's really wonderful.
And I will say too, like chapter 1, it's very dense and it is a bit dry, but like the whole book is not dry. And like as you go through the book, like to me it gets better and better. Actually, I think chapter 8 was my favorite chapter because I think in chapter 8, I'm pretty sure we kind of revisited this idea of a physical Sabbath, and we talked about the Sabbath Queen and like these various forms. And like you had talked about, the Sabbath Queen being this heretical woman who committed all these terrible acts, or this beautiful whore or whatever, or not even a mortal person at all. And like I found those concepts of the Sabbath Queen really, really interesting. Let me see what other notes I put in here. Because like if I wrote it down, I must have thought it was important. The owl being witches and poisoning and cannibalizing.
Yeah, the Strix.
Like I thought that was really cool. And I saw kind of like a similarity there because when I was like looking into just like shape shifting and witchcraft, like period, for a video that I had done before, I saw also a lot of that in Central America as well. And also there being kind of almost a similar concept, actually. The night women, chef's kiss, iconic, of course.
Yeah, the concept of night wandering women, especially of like this sort of cannibalistic, shape-shifting night woman, like you'll find that pop up in many cultures across the world.
Yeah.
It is, I mean, it's iconic.
It is, and I want to be friends with them. Like, you know? What would you say would be your biggest challenge when you were writing this book? What is something that you as the author found challenging with this book?
There's sort of two things that instantly come to mind. One of them is just like the sheer amount of history, because chapter 1 could have been way longer, could have been its own entire book.
Yeah.
In fact, I would recommend the book, The Witch by Ronald Hutton, as sort of a good companion piece, because that book specifically looks at the development of the witch archetype. And I think that, I mean, obviously that goes very hand in hand. But yeah, there's a lot, you know, and also looking at the Sabbath from like a multi cultural lens, even within, right? Like I specifically, my scope was narrowed in on Europe and the early American colonies, because that's largely, I mean, that is where witchcraft comes from. But even within that narrow scope, like there's still so much information. And so trying to figure out like what to include and what to leave out was really difficult. And it also sort of continues to be an ongoing curse, because now that the book is out, I'll be, you know, reading through different texts and I'll find something and I'll be like, damn it, like that's a really juicy piece of information that would have been excellent in the book. So I've had to come to terms with that when I find something like that, to be like, okay, well, this can go in something in the future. And so then the second part of what was really difficult was barriers in terms of research. So a big one would be language barrier. A lot of countries, the texts on their witch trials or their folklore is written in their language, and it's not a language I know, and there's no translations. So therefore I can't access that. Or texts that are either long out of print, or are ones that you can find online, but only for like exorbitant amounts of money, secondhand. So there were research barriers in that way. You know, the Sabbath comes up in a lot of different countries, and unfortunately some I wasn't able to talk about because of those reasons. A good example of like of a country somewhere in the middle is Poland. There's really only to date one text on the Polish witch trials that's in English. And it's, you know, it's a pretty tiny book. And so that was the only resource I had for talking about the Sabbath in Polish witch lore. So I kind of had to take what I could find.
Yeah. No, like I could see how that would be challenging, especially on like a language barrier. And I feel like there's a lot of facets of like the occult in general that are kind of like kept within these various languages. I have some questions from the book club that I'd like to get into too.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Let's see. So, and also too, if anyone has any questions for Kelden and they're, you know, watching this as a replay, you can also leave those questions for Kelden here in the comment section, or if you're watching this live, like you can leave the comments and we'll try to get to all of them. Hi, Hellbound Heathen, Indiana, Akamensis, Beanbag Hagwag, Carmilla, Ivy's Grove, Little Red, the Trans Folk Witch. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So one of the folks in book club says, apologies if you've already answered some of these in the book. I'm only about a fourth of the way through it so far. But one, how many Sabbaths have you attended? What elements have been particularly memorable for you? I think that's kind of like a two-part question. So like, take that wherever you want to, Kelden.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how many, I think it's like, I don't really have a count of that. Many would be my answer. This has been an ongoing part of my practice for a long time. So it's kind of one of those things that eventually you sort of lose track of.
Yeah. I think, a video that you had made from like 5 years ago talking about the witch's devil.
So, and then in terms of like most memorable elements, I would say really just like any encounter with spirit, particularly the devil or the Sabbath queen. Anytime that there's sort of these moments of, it's almost like everything is so frenzied, and it's this merriment around you. All of this stuff is going on, and then there's these moments sometimes where it's like everything around you stills, and it's just you and those particular spirits, and you're in this like quiet bubble within all of it, and you're having this very direct conversation or moment in time, and those have always been really special to me. And then, after that moment passes, it's like everything kind of speeds back up and you're sort of pulled back into all of it. But also I would say also just like the scenery. I mean, the different elements, like central elements to a Sabbath meeting often include things like a big central fire, a lot of dancing, and the setting of the Sabbath can really fluctuate, and it depends on the person. But for me, it's often this desolate kind of mountaintop where you're kind of at the top of this mountain, and you're in this kind of clearing in the center of these tall pine trees. It's a really kind of evergreen scenery, and so just engaging with that otherworldly landscape is also really memorable to me.
How old, do you think you were the first time, you were recognizing that, you were flying to the Witches Sabbath as a tea, as opposed to doing it and maybe not having the language? What age do you think you were when you started kind of actualizing it?
Probably, I mean, that would have been probably in my early 20s. So, honestly, not all that long ago. But outside of that, in terms of doing it without having that language, much younger. And that's something that I often tell people. Sometimes people ask well, how do I know? Or how do I know if I've been to a Witches Sabbath? And for a lot of people, chances are you have, and you just haven't realized it, because you either just didn't have the language for that, or you weren't sort of looking for that experience.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot. And I think that's why, language can be important, because there's so many things that we experience that we don't have the language for, versus when we do have language for, I feel like the first time for me personally, when I kind of was meeting the witch's devil, I had no concept of the witch's devil at the time.
Right.
Had a whole dream about it, wrote it in my book of shadows, talked to a bunch of other witches in my local area who I was good Judies with. And I was like, what the hell is this spirit in my dream? Nothing was matching up. And then now, years later, looking back, I'm like, wow, that makes a lot of sense for me. But at that time, I had no idea.
Right.
And in our Crooked Path live stream, so much of that was so affirmative for me, because there were so many practices that I had been doing or had connected with that I had no language for. And so it was kind of cool to be oh wow, this is not just Jasmyne's UPG show. There's other witches connecting to this hive collective as well. So I thought that was, yeah. Okay, here's another question that's not on this list, but it's one that I have for you.
Okay.
I always try to have like pop culture references, especially in book club as
Mhm.
well. And like, I don't know if you, I think we talked about this. I don't remember what you said, but I recently watched Coven of Sisters.
Yeah.
That movie, to me, I would associate that with this.
Yes. Yes, very, very much. If anybody has not watched that movie, you really should, because it's very good. And actually, a lot of that movie, and I can't remember if I looked this up to verify or if this is just like me being like pretty sure. Because the movie is set in the Basque region. And a lot of the sort of imagery and stuff in the folklore in that movie comes from one of the learned authorities that I reference a lot in the book is Pierre de Lancre. And he was specifically writing about the witch trials in the Basque region, talking about the Witches Sabbath. And I think they pulled a lot of that lore from his material. So I think it is very much, I think it is. I think it is very related to the idea of the Witches Sabbath. I mean, we see in that movie like that sort of leading up to the end scene. I don't want to give spoilers, but they're sort of enacting the Sabbath. So we get to kind of see that play out.
Yeah, and I thought like the yellow dress was interesting too, because like I remember in the book, in the Witches Sabbath book, like you had talked also about like these colors of like clothing that like either people attending or the Sabbath Queen would be in. So,
right.
And then there's also like the witch, like the witch. I think that's very Witches Sabbath.
One of my favorite depictions of a Witches Sabbath is actually in a book, and it's The Witches of New York by Amy Mckay.
Okay.
And so in that book, one of the characters has a dream about the Witches Sabbath, and the Witches Sabbath is taking place around the Statue of Liberty. And so it has all of this sort of like, the book is set still sort of in the past. It's not like modern, but it has that sort of like modern to that time imagery, but it's still this Sabbath where they all have their torches and they're kind of dancing around Lady Liberty. And I just think it's a really powerful way of showing like how, how these gatherings persist over time and how the imagery around them shifts to the person or the place. It's very adaptable in that sense.
I remember when you could like still go into the Statue of Liberty in the physical. Like, I think they've had that shut down for like years, but I don't know if they've opened that back up. Maybe like an NYC witch can like chime in. I don't think so, but Hellbound Heathen, this is an iconic comment. Henbane and Belladonna Airlines, we hope your flight is pleasant. That was something else I wanted to talk to you about, was like some of the flying ointments. Some of that might be an off-air discussion. Because like I know that is, and I thought like it was very wise of you as an author to like address that situation with like caution and care and like, for entertainment purposes only, legally speaking here, maybe reconsider like.
Right. Well, it's a very complex topic, because, there is a lot of modern use of flying ointment, and specifically out of, plants like henbane, belladonna, from the Solanaceae family, and that is something that people do. It's something that I do, but it takes a lot of knowledge and responsibility. And so it needs to be approached in a way that is respectful, not only because you're dealing with plants that are toxic, but you're dealing with plant spirits. I mean, at the heart of this, we always go back to the animist perspective that like, you're not just engaging with inert matter. Like this is a whole spirit, and that spirit demands respect, especially in my experience, the Solanaceae family, especially Belladonna. She demands respect, and if you don't, those plants are going to fuck you up. They're not going to take kindly to you. That being said, I also think it's really important to put out more information about, all of the different ways that we can engage with entheogens or substances that facilitate trance state, that there's more, especially with like flying women's, for example, like there's more than just these specific plants. Like these specific plants are very rooted in folklore, but that doesn't mean that they're the only ones. And so two powerful plants that are often pulled in and used in terms of flying women are mugwort and wormwood. And so in the book, and it's the same recipe that's in the Crooked Path, but I include my sort of non-toxic or less toxic flying ointment recipe because a lot of people do want to create their own. And so I wanted to put out a effective recipe that's not also then going to endanger you if you don't necessarily know how to handle poisonous plants.
And I think that was very wise.
Mm-hmm. And I love that recipe. So I think it works very well. And I think it's a good testament to the fact that like you don't need these specific plants. You also the tea is also like you don't need flying ointment to engage in spirit flight. It can be very helpful. And there are traditions that are very centered around that. So like I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I'm also trying to let people understand and know that it's not necessary. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have that knowledge, if you're not comfortable with that, like you can still do these things.
What are some of the most powerful locations or types of places to hold a Sabbath?
Mm-hmm.
Physically speaking,
I would say really anywhere out in nature that is wild, particularly sort of like in between places. But I think really anywhere can be a powerful place. But per folklore, you'd really be looking at sort of places like mountaintops, crossroads, cemeteries or churchyards, seashores, which I think is always a fun one. That doesn't come up as often, but it comes up in some folklore that Sabbaths are kind of held on the beach.
Which I would love even like a riverbank moment, like
mm-hmm.
literally from like the movie The Craft, where they're like summoning like Monin or whatever, Maman or whatever whoever they were summoning. Like I think they were on the beach or the riverbank or something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, you're seeking out a liminal place. I mean, that's not necessarily talked about in the folklore in that sense of it, like being like called to attention that these are liminal places, but a lot of them are. I mean, when we think about mountaintops, you're in between the sky and the land. When you're on the seashore, you're between the land and the sea. Crossroads, I mean, you're in between. Churchyards, you're in between the living and the dead. Even like meadows or fields, you're in between two usually kind of distinctly separated pieces of land. So, but the other thing too, and like the reason that I do say like anywhere can be a powerful Sabbath is it's really kind of what you bring to it. And also I just, I don't want to like make anybody feel like if they can't go to those types of locations that they can't do this work either. Because safety should always come first. I mean, maybe that doesn't sound as like cool and spooky, but like, you're not going to have a very good Sabbath if you like end up lost in the woods or getting eaten by a bear or, something like that. Like use your discernment.
Show up, like the cops show
right.
up or,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
what advice would you give to a group that is hoping to host a Sabbath for the first time?
So I'm gonna sort of separate this into two answers. One for like if you're doing a physical enactment, and then one if you're like trying to meet together in the other world, which I talk about in the book. So if you are, if you are doing a physical enactment, I think, it's just important to think about like, what is the goal of this Sabbath? And that doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, we're coming together to work this specific magic. Like, it could mean that, but it could also be like, we're just coming together to sort of be wild and crazy. Looking and preparing like your imagery, like kind of what sort of like folkloric motifs do you want to bring into this, or that you want to tap into? Because you're tapping into a living, breathing folklore, which is a spirit all of its own. And so how are you going to access that? Are you going to do that by, playing specific instruments, or wearing certain outfits, or, doing a certain dance? What can you bring to it in that sense? And then it's similar in the sense of like, okay, so like, if you are a group and you're like, we're going to go into the other world, we're going to try to find each other and meet together at this Sabbath, at this moment. So first you want to consider like, are you all together in the same physical space? Because that's a little bit easier versus like if you're all kind of spread out, like you have to do some like time planning, like, okay, like at 9:30 p.m. Central Time, we're all gonna lay down and start doing like our, like our breathing and getting into trance. Versus like if you're physically together, you can all do that together. And you also want to think like beforehand, like, okay, what is sort of, again, what is the imagery we're tapping into? Because if you're all sort of thinking about the same imagery, you're going to be able to find each other a lot more. But it certainly can be done, but I think finding people in the same place in the other world and then having the same experience is sort of difficult, because even if you do find each other, like there's no guaranteeing that you're all having the same experience. So you might come back from that, and your stories might be different of what you experience, and that's okay too.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of, let's say, groups of people, whether they are doing this, they're all doing it from the comfort of like their own home, right? At the same time, but in different physical places. Or if they're doing this on like, I don't know, the floor of someone's living room, right?
Sure.
Like what does that look like when, let's say, these 4 different witches have like 4 different complete experiences, yet they're encountering maybe like a fracture of another witch's like fetch or something in the astral? Like, is this going into like spirit mimicry territory, or is this like that is an astral projection of your concept of that person? Like, how would you know if this was like the real tea or not?
I don't think there's an easy answer for that. And because like I will just like be forthright, like that's starting to approach territory where I'm like, I just don't care. Like there's some things where like for me personally, like I'm just like, whatever happens, it's like, like is it that it is, like this actual person's spirit? Is it that it's just my perception of them? Is it both? Does it matter? I think it's something that you would have to determine on a case-by-case basis.
Would you determine it? I meant more in the sense that, like, let's say you, me, and 3 other people are sitting on someone's living room floor, and like we're flying out to the Sabbath and blah, blah, blah. And afterwards we're having a couple cocktails and we're eating pizza and we're talking about our experience, And if I'm like, oh my gosh, so I was here and there doing this and that, and then girl, here you came along. And then I was like, and then you were like, girl,
Right.
that's crazy because I was over here doing this and that with them and them. Like, would that be confirmation that like maybe that was more of a mimic or your projection, your own psyche's projection of that person? Or could it be that like both experiences, like two things can be true at the same time? I don't know. I find it like interesting to think about.
I think it's very much a case of like they both could be true at the same time.
Pull cards on it.
What? Yeah. Well, because I personally think that like, you know, and we talk about this when we talk about like sort of like the triple spirit or triple soul, is that I think that our spirit exists in many facets. And so it's possible that like one aspect of our spirit is having this experience, and then there's like this other aspect that's over there with you sort of having this other experience. So I don't know. It's kind of, it's a mystery.
Is there anything that you think could be physically helpful if a group of people were trying to project themselves and fly out to like the Sabbath? Like, I mean, I could think of like maybe everyone using the same flying ointment.
Yeah, like maybe something that like you create as like kind of a group tether. So I can imagine like, you know, like if you created some sort of charm, like
a talisman or an amulet.
Yeah, that like everyone has the same one. And like, I'm even thinking about something like, again, like this, you know, would sort of be maybe difficult to do, but like, even if you had like a little like bag with like a strand of everyone's hair or like some sort of like physical tag lock of that person, that then everyone has that. So you're all like, you all have a piece of that other person's essence.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. I love the historical background that you provide in your books. What drew you to your love of history, and how does it inform your personal practice?
In terms of like what drew me to history, like I think it was really just this pivotal point in my undergraduate career where I just started questioning everything. Like I was, you know, at this point, like, or at that point, like I had been reading witchcraft books and Wicca books for a long time. And I just got to this point where I was just really dissatisfied with a lot of like the historical information I was reading. And so I was like, okay, well, I can sit here and complain about this, or I can do my own research. I can try to figure this out myself. And so I just started kind of trying to work my way back through time. So like one of the things I did is I started pulling out the books by, you know, the early pioneers of the modern witchcraft movement, and reading their work, and then reading the works that they were pulling from, and then kind of following this train backwards. And I don't think I've ever really stopped. You know, from that point, it's just like I was just obsessed, you know, and I've always loved stories. I love telling stories. And so folklore has always been very important to me. So that plays into it as well, of like researching this folklore. Where does this folklore come from? Where did that, like, right? It's just this never ending chain. The other thing too is like, I at heart am a little detective. Like that's always been, ever since I was a little child, like obsessed with investigating and snooping and looking for clues. And so like it's like my brain sort of gets to this place where like I get fixated on something and it's like I have to know. And so I'll just start pouring through books and looking for references. And I don't know, I just get super excited and pumped. So and then in terms of like how it plays into my life and my practice, I mean, it does completely, because so much, I mean, as a traditional witch, my practice is really rooted in folklore and finding out, these different stories and where different things come from. And I would say even outside of that, I think it's important to know the context of like the things that we do. And that's one of the things that, kind of going back to like that time in my life in college, where like, that was one of the questions that was coming up for me a lot. It was like, well, all of these books are saying, do this, this, or this, or like, oh, the athame, but like, why? Where does that come from? Like, why do we do that? Why, nobody ever explains like where this comes from. And so it was like, I want to know why I'm doing this. And I think that's important regardless who we are. And I think that extends outside of like witchcraft itself, like knowing the context of like why we do the things we do is important.
Agreed. Big purr. Another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to know the author's personal opinion on the devil, since the devil and the Sabbath go hand in hand a lot in the book. I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. So,
what's your personal relationship?
My personal relationship with the devil is very close.
Personal.
It's close. We're close. It's a close relationship. So in terms of like the history and folklore, I think the first thing that is important to look at is like the distinction between the theological devil and the folkloric devil. This is a distinction that scholars and folklorists will bring up. So like the theological devil being very much Satan, very much attached to the Bible, whereas like the folkloric devil is more of this trickster spirit. He's more of this literary character, and he's often sort of removed from biblical context. And so one thing that is interesting to consider when looking at witchcraft folklore, when looking at confessional materials, is the way that a lot of different spirits were labeled as the devil or devils. And in a way, a lot of them came to survive under that banner. I was just listening to an episode of the Invoking Witchcraft podcast, and they were talking about how it's interesting how a lot of like folkloric pieces survived into today by sort of being Christianized. And how if that hadn't happened, we likely wouldn't have some of these things today. We wouldn't have been able to sort of look back on them. So I think that's kind of interesting, especially when we look at these different spirits. The other thing too, and this is a lot of like kind of speculation and conjecture. There's no real evidence that anyone was actually doing this. But it's fun to think about, like sort of this thing that happens where it's like, okay, hey people, like you can either worship our God, who's very like cut and dry, like deny all things that make you human, or you can keep worshiping these gods or these spirits who, this is the devil, and the devil's trying, like in a lot of ways sounds way more fun. Like who are you going to go with? And it's funny because actually one of the like sort of like a historian who like this is like going into like the 1800s was writing about his hypotheses regarding the witch trials in Germany, and he basically said that like when Christianity was taking hold, they kind of came to the German pagans and they're like, hey, like what you're doing, like this is Satanism. And he's kind of saying that like in response, they were like, okay, well, we're Satanists now. And they just went with it. Which again, like that's not historically sound. But again, it's sort of this same, kind of this same folklore. and so in a lot of ways too, like a question that I often get asked today is like, okay, well, Kelden, like if you see the devil as sort of this collection of spirits, why would you refer to them as the devil? That's not a good term, right? Like that's bad. And my response to that is always asking people, well, why do we use the term witch? Like being a witch was never, like the term witch was never a positive thing until relatively recently. But it's a reclaiming. And I think in a lot of ways that's, what the devil's about. I mean, the devil, again, even as this sort of folk character, and we can even see this and look at it through this lens when looking through trial folklore, is that the devil is an illuminator. He's an initiator. He represents rebellion, especially for those who have been horribly oppressed and have been failed by their community. The devil teaches this like forbidden wisdom that, it taps into that sort of, I'm failing to think of the name, which is terrible. But it's this flame, it's this divine spark that gives us knowledge and power and liberates us. So, I don't know, there's so much I could say about the devil. But I think too, just as the leader of the Sabbath, I mean, that is also what the Sabbath is about. American suffragist Matilda Jocelyn Gage, in her book Women, Church, and State, touches on this, and she actually says, that the Sabbath, this Witches Sabbath really was the silent protest of the people who had been failed by their state. In her mind, she sees it as this coming together of people to rebel, and what better leader than the devil?
Love that. I would like to know, earlier, Kelden, you talked about like sometimes like just getting wild at the Sabbath, like not necessarily having a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you in particular getting wild at the Sabbath?
I don't know if I could say that. I mean, it's wild. And again, it differs. I mean, like what happens at the Sabbath can be, can be wildly different. Sometimes you go and it's more, for lack of better words, business oriented. It's more focused on like specific works of magic. Sometimes it's more solemn almost, versus other times it's much more of that like celebratory pleasure fest. So how I get wild, dancing is a big part for me, just especially because if we think about the ways in which like the Sabbath is this like shedding of inhibitions, I think about some of the ways sometimes like maybe I'm like self-conscious, like dancing, like this is a time when I can really just completely let that go and just like be a total freak. So dancing, there's sexual components at times. That's not, in my experience, like that's not been a major focus for me. But that is a major focus for a lot of people, and that's a major part of the Sabbath. So that can come up. Lots of wine.
What's your favorite kind of wine? What's your favorite kind of wine?
Merlot. I'm a Merlot girly.
Tell me too, Kelden, while we have a little bit of more, like we got like 10 more minutes or so left. Also in the book, in terms of like physical Sabbath meetings, you also talked about like having different people like in attendance and like roles and things like that. Have you ever, I don't know how to phrase this question right, but like, have you ever been the devil at the Sabbath or the Sabbath queen?
I have not. I was asked to fulfill that role But then COVID happened.
Oh.
So there is a sort of like private camp retreat thing that I have gone to where they do a big Sabbath enactment, and it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy. It's so like just surreal. And to be honest, I don't know if I would want to step into that role. Just at least in this, in that particular scenario, because I see both sides of it. Like I see the ritual aspect, and then like the prep and the aftermath, and just like the physical toll that can take. And so I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for that just yet. Maybe someday. Now, if it was like more of a sort of low key thing, then yeah, I think I would be down for that. But I also tend to be more of a solitary person. So usually I'm not really doing a lot of like physical Sabbath kind of enactments.
Well, and I feel like a group could theoretically just like not even use a physical person too.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like they could use like the sting, right?
Right. So, I mean, sometimes people will have like sort of like a stand-in. I mean, a lot of times that's how the sting is used. Sometimes people like really dress it up to sort of embody the devil. But I mean, yeah, even if somebody's not sort of acting in that like physical role, I mean, the devil is still there if, you know, if that's, I don't want to necessarily say if invited. I mean, if invited, but I know there are a lot of people that don't work with the devil. And I talk about that in the book about how like the spirits that show up at the Sabbath will vary. And sometimes there will be spirits there that you aren't familiar with. But you know, like if you're not somebody who works with the devil, the chances of the devil like appearing there as like sort of the presiding leader, like is probably not going to happen. You're going to probably encounter a spirit that you do work with, stepping into that role.
What do you think, or what can you say more about the Queen of Elfame? Because I know that in book club, there's like some conversation going on about like, who is she? And like, where can we get more resources on her? Like, how do we understand her better? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, well, so the Queen of Elfame, I mean, she is the fairy queen. And this is a concept that really comes out of Scottish and Irish folklore. We see the name Elfame come up in certain trial transcripts. So, I mean, really, like, by that specific name, like, you know, like there's, you know, a handful of sources. But I mean, really what you're doing is you're looking into who is the fairy queen. You know, and she has many different names in different cultures. She has different guises. And so in terms of the Sabbath, like, because there is this, there's a lot of folklore about gatherings of fairies, and sometimes people are sort of brought into that, either willingly or unwillingly. Sometimes specifically magical practitioners or witches. And in a lot of ways, they look very similar to Sabbath meetings. There's a lot of the same elements: dancing, feasting, sex. And so there's sort of these parallel experiences. But in terms of like a witch's Sabbath, sometimes, right, there's this character, this female leader, and sometimes she's talked about in the sense of being a fairy. She's a fairy woman, or at least the way she's talked about, she's described in terms of being sort of otherworldly. And so that's often perceived then as being the fairy queen. And so when we pull that lore into modern practice, it's often talked about, right, as like the devil and the fairy queen. And they kind of come together and hang out, or they work solitary and alone. I guess it's really up to, you know, the individual, because we all experience these things so differently. It's hard to, you know, say conclusively what's what.
Crafton said, I guess I got here at the right time. I'm trying to meet the Queen of Elfame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think going into the other world, attending a witch's Sabbath would be a place where that's quite likely to happen. That's a good place to find her. And I know there's a lot, I would say that it's sort of a witchcraft like hot topic about working with the fair folk and, is it dangerous? Is it safe? And, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that. I guess in the quick cliff notes version of it is that I think, it's in a lot of ways it's no different than working with any other spirit. You have to be, responsible and cunning and all of those things. But I think when we look at the folklore I mean, it's evident in a lot of places that witches and magical practitioners tend to have a more positive relationship with the fair folk. I think it's because we're both sort of tuned into similar wavelengths. And I think they also see that we are typically engaging with the world, especially the natural landscape, with more respect. And so I think they're more beneficently inclined towards us. But yeah, there's a lot. I talk about that in both books. So,
and I highly recommend those books. I really do. And I really do feel like The Crooked Path is a great kind of intro before, I think, reading The Witches Sabbath.
Yeah, I would agree. Especially because, I mean, really the Witches Sabbath was sort of born out of The Crooked Path and my editor's insistence that I cut down on the Sabbath material in it because it was disproportionately longer than the other sections in the book. So, but they do go very hand in hand.
Another turtle made it to the water. Yeah. The other night, one of my coven mates and I, we were actually stuffing eggs for our Beltane ritual coming up because we have like this witchy egg hunt. This is totally off topic. But I've gotten super back into playing World of Warcraft, and in Battle for Azeroth, the Tortolan people, that was something that would say, another turtle made it to the water. So it just like stuck in my head because I would like write a little fortune and then I would chuck it at my coven mate and they would stuff it in the egg. And I was being very obnoxious. So I know it's hard to believe. Like, well, thank you, Kelden, so much for coming on and allowing me to reschedule this and coming back
no problem.
Talking about the Witches Sabbath. Like, really enjoyed this book. I mean, I've enjoyed both of your books that I've read so far. And tell us on this stream again where we can find you, the best place to get your books.
Yep. So best place to get my books, always first and foremost, support local. So if you have like a local occult or witchy store, check to see if they have it. They should, because I'm pretty cool. But, support local. Otherwise, you can get it from all of the big name places. I'm not going to shame anyone for getting it from Amazon. I will say the best place to leave a book review is on Amazon. So if you feel inclined to leave a book review, that would be the best place to do that. And the best place to find me is on Instagram at Kelden Mercury. That's typically where you can get in contact with me and you can see, some updates. There's a third book in the works where there's a whole story about the Queen of Elfame, or she's featured very prominently within it. So it's a book of original folk tales and rhymes. So it's a bit of a departure from the nonfiction. But if you are a savvy, cunning witch, you can maybe find pieces of practical information hidden within it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And thank you for everyone in the chat. Beanbag, Indiana, Paige, Little Red, Hellbound Heathen, Laura, good to see you. Good to see you in here, Laura. Galaxy, Crafton. Okay, we got to end this stream before it hits 60. So we're going to end this. We'll be together still after we end it.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, guys. Thank you.